So the vision that is going to continue now is going to be a raising up and a removing of kings and a setting up of God of times, of their allotted times for reign. Also here, Daniel tells him that the God in heaven who reveals secrets Nebuchadnezzar is making known to you. By this vision, he is telling you, making known to you what will happen in the latter days. This is verse 28 of chapter 2. And he reminds him, says, you were on your bed before you had this dream. You were thinking about what's going to come to pass. What's going to happen? What's going to become of me and my kingdom after these things? He reminds him of that. And then he tells him the dream, because he'd forgotten. He said, you were beholding this great image. It was amazing. It was awesome. And you saw that the image's head was made of gold, of fine gold. Its chest and arms were made of silver. Its belly and thighs were made of brass. Its legs were made of iron, and its feet were partly of iron and clay. This is just the vision. He's going to give the interpretation. And you watched while a stone was cut out without hands and struck the image on its feet. By the way, to be this cut out without hands means that this is a judgment against the nations of this world that comes from a place not of man's origin. And Daniel 7 deals with this specifically. That's what that cut out without hands. This is a divine judgment against the nations. And then what happened after that? The iron, the clay, the silver, the bronze, the gold, they were crushed together, and the wind carried them away so that there was no trace. And this stone that did this grew into a huge mountain. And it was a kingdom that spread throughout the whole earth. Okay, so now here Daniel gives him the interpretation. This is what this means, king. This head of gold, the God of heaven has given you a kingdom. And verse 38, you are this head of gold. You and your kingdom are represented by this head of gold. And God gave this vision to Nebuchadnezzar in terms that he would understand. Remember, he was an idol worshiper. And there was a set, gold, more valuable than silver, which is more valuable than bronze, which is more valuable. And so all these things, Daniel's going to continue describing this. After you will arise another kingdom inferior to yours. And the king would have understood this, because gold is more precious than silver, which is more precious than bronze. And then a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And notice where he spends most of his time. This is significant. He just makes quick mention, you're the head of gold, another inferior after you, then a kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. And then he talks about the fourth, being as strong as iron. And he describes this kingdom, that it breaks in pieces and shatters everything, even as iron crushes, and breaks in pieces and crushes everything else. So this is where he spends his time. And then he gets to the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron. The kingdom will be divided, yet some part of the legs of iron are going to continue into the feet. The strength of the kingdom that was before it continues. And yet, it's partly weak and partly strong. Just as iron and clay do not mix. And then he says this about this. The kingdom will be partly strong and partly fragile. And then he talks about them trying to connect and cleave to each other, that they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to each other. This is important. Make a note of it. We're going to come back to it. And in the days of these kings, in the days of the iron mixed with clay, the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and it will stand forever. And it shall not be left to other people. Okay, so God is going to set up his kingdom. Take a look at your outline there for Daniel 2. The head of gold, silver, bronze, iron and clay. Let me just tell you, let's see. Why does God choose? I'll just tell you this. You can study it out later, and as we continue on, you'll see that this is clear. Head of gold, we were told in this vision, was Babylon. There's no question on that. What's the kingdom that followed Babylon? It was Medo-Persia. What followed Medo-Persia? It was Greece. What followed Greece? It was Rome. And then a divided Rome of some sort. And then as that stone crushed and destroyed, there was it's not specifically mentioned, but it's an implied judgment. God renders a judgment against all of these nations that have been ruling on the earth because they were crushed and the wind blew them away. And there was no trace of them found. So there was a judgment. It's not specifically stated, but you'll see why I've included it there, because it is specifically stated in Daniel 7. And finally, the great mountain representing God's kingdom grows out of that. Now, there were other great civilizations. The Mayans, the Aztecs, the Chinese. Why are they absent from this? The reason they're absent is because they do not come into contact with the people of God. This was a vision given to Daniel. Remember, the people of God were in exile in Babylon. And so God gives a vision specifically for the purpose of telling his people of what is going to happen to them. As you see, look at Babylon. We know that Babylon had control over Palestine and Jerusalem. And the kingdom that followed was Persia. And not only did it conquer Babylon, but of course it also, again, had dominion over Palestine, over the people of God at this time. Also Greece, when Persian Empire gave way to Greece, the same thing again happened. The people of God in Palestine, again, were ruled by Greece. And then Rome. And we know that during the time of Christ, when he was here, that it was Roman rule that was over the people of God. And it was a Roman edict and a Roman instrument of torture that put Jesus to death. And so this is why these other nations, China and other things, they're not important enough because they don't directly come into contact with the people of God. This is why these are the nations that God is giving prophecy about. Okay, and this is what Rome, the Empire of Rome was picked apart by Germanic tribes. They're not German, Germanic tribes. And these are the names of the tribes, and they broke up, and there were 10 of them. And as you can see, that this is represented in the 10 toes. That there will be partly strength, there's going to be a partial strength and a partial weakness. And they will, remember that verse that talked about that they shall mingle with the seed of men? All through the age of Europe, kings giving their daughters, to each other, forming alliances and having alliances being broken. All through this time, but they shall not cleave together, the Bible prophecy specifically says. So what do we have? And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. So this is what we know so far. Judgment, according to the New Testament, the judgment of God's people occurs sometime after AD 31. You have the verses, we looked at those. And also this is the gold representing Babylon. Silver, Medo-Persia, brass, and Greece, those are not specifically stated in this prophecy. But if you know your world history, you know that each one of these powers gave place to the one that followed. Babylon was conquered. You read about that right there in Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar, the last night of Babylon, the great party that was going on. Who came and conquered? Darius the Mede conquered Babylon. And he would eventually send back, it was prophesied in Isaiah, that he would send God's people back to Jerusalem and they would rebuild. And they would still be subject to the Persians. But they would have their freedom to go back home and to rebuild the city and the sanctuary. And then iron and clay representing Europe, the divided nations. The image crushed, like I said, judgment is not explicitly mentioned, but the fact that the images are crushed and the nation, there's a form of judgment that goes on there. And what follows is God bringing in his eternal kingdom, which is represented by the stone, cut without hands. It's not of this world. It comes from heaven. Who is the stone? Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone. He is the one who inherits all these